Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here and to welcome here Professor Teun Dijk from Barcelona, who will give us an exceptional, I'm sure, exceptional lecture on, or two lectures on critical discourse studies and more generally discourse and the world. And also then the second lecture will be dedicated to a fascinating, I would say, topic, which will be far-right ideologies, or how Professor Van Dijk would put it, reactionary right. So without further ado, I would like to welcome and invite Professor Teun Van Dijk to the floor. And I hope that you will enjoy both of the lectures. Thank you.
Good morning, dobrý den. Christian, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you also for inviting me here. It has been a long time. Last time I was in Prague, and it was wonderful. It is wonderful to be here again, to talk with people and reply to questions afterwards. I will probably, in the beginning, say many things many of you already know, but we have to get warming up for things which are a little bit more new and which have to do with the work of the last years. Okay, let me, for those of you who don't know much about discourse analysis, recall that in the 60s and the 70s, not only internationally, there was like a cultural revolution, about which I will talk in my next talk a little bit more, because that is also one of the reasons and one of the causes of the extreme right, because its cultural revolution also was more liberal, and what we now find in many countries is an illiberal backlash. And I would like to talk about it afterwards, but today, just about discourse. So what happened with all kinds of changes in many disciplines, that in the 60s and 70s, there was some kind of discursive turn. In many disciplines, suddenly people were not interested in language or words, but actually in discourse, text and talk. And you find that in many disciplines. I just will, in a few minutes, recall, for those of you who don't know this, for example, in anthropology, we had the work of Del Hymes about communicative events. Well, as you remember, a little bit of linguistics many years ago said it, from Saussure until, let's say, Chomsky, it was basically grammatical structures and so on. So what happened in the 60s and 70s, suddenly people started to talk about discourse. In anthropology, it was like this. In sociology, of course, microsociology, ethnomethodology, people were interested more and more in the discourses which have to do with interaction, like everyday talk, conversation. So conversation analysis, today, nearly an independent discipline, so vast. In linguistics, of course, there was more and more people. In Germany, for example, people started to do text grammatic. Here in Czechoslovakia, then in Prague, of course, people in functional linguistics more and more interested in discourse. One of the representatives is here in front of me, Eva Chikova, and of course Petr Skal and other people, colleagues, who were reading in the 70s and learning a lot. So that is changes in linguistics. In psychology, people were more and more interested after applying, for example, Chomsky and generative linguistics in psychology about what happens in the mind, in the brain, the mind, basically, when people are producing grammatical structure, how people do learn these complex kind of things. So that was one of these movements. But suddenly also in the 70s, people said, no, we are more interested in the cognitive processes involved in the production and the comprehension of discourse. And of course, that is fundamental, because also when you apply it in education, for example, how do people learn from textbooks, from interaction in school. We did have no idea how structures of language, and specific structures of discourse, were related to understanding, to knowledge, and how knowledge and the structures of knowledge had an influence on the way people were processing discourse. So that was something, especially also in psychology. In communication, there was also changes, and people suddenly became interested also in news. I mean, there had been studies of news before that, but in the 70s and 70s, we had people who were interested in, let's say, the everyday sociology of how news is being produced. So you had all kinds of studies. That was, for example, more in sociology. But in communication, we had a group in Glasgow, in England, usually called the Bad News Group, because the first book of these people was called Bad News. And the second book was called More Bad News. And then the third book was called Really Bad News. So they had a whole sequence of books. They were not linguists, but people more in communication, but still the things they did was basically study all kinds of text. You know, how people also talk, you know, outside the factory when there is a strike. So all kinds of discourses which linguists would never even have a look at were studied in very, very many disciplines. Of course, also education. I mean, suddenly people were also interested in language in school. Of course, textbooks. Textbook analysis became very much interested. And of course, also the interaction in the classroom. So all these disciplines suddenly turned to text, talk, discourse, and some things which are way above and more complex than just words, and more complex than just sentences. In the social sciences, as you well know, we had in those times content analysis, which is basically coding and counting, coding words and so on and so on. And from that moment on, we knew much more about the structures way beyond just words and sentences. So things became, people started to do narrative analysis, and in very many disciplines. For example, also in sociology, of course, we had Bill above in sociolinguistics, being interested in everyday storytelling. Were you ever afraid to die? And he interviewed people and say, what are these structures of? So all these things were moving at the same time. John Gumpertz, also in sociolinguistics, was interested in tiny cues which somehow mark how where people come from, their perspective and so on. So that is something I would like to mention at the beginning of what I would like to talk about today, more critical approaches, is unthinkable without all these disciplines doing these kind of things, and all these disciplines continue this kind of work. So in the cognitive psychology of discourse processing, there's a journal which does it mainly, and even when they do not learn lots about sociolinguistics or anthropology or other communication, each of these disciplines continue to do this kind of thing. But, and that's for me even more interesting is the fact that now also people got to know each other. People started to read things in communication, people in communication were doing reading in linguistics and so on. At the end, I will briefly talk about my last book, which was just published, is on the social movement discourse. People in sociology were studying social movements, but they, although most of the texts they were reading were actually discourses, they never opened a book in discourse analysis. Now, that was a problem, and therefore I wrote this last book. But it is not also always the case that people always know what is happening in other disciplines. And many people in the social sciences, for example, don't even look at psychology, because psychology for them is something individual. They are forgetting that part of the mind is called social function, and how to talk about knowledge, ideology, and so on, without doing that. So, unfortunately, although there's much more cooperation, and in journals you find many references to other disciplines, most of research is still within disciplines, and I regret it very much. I'm an editor of several of these discourse journals, and I always welcome when people of other disciplines bring their ideas, which we don't know, to our discipline. So one of the major dimensions of discourse analysis for me is this multidisciplinary cooperation among different disciplines and different people, and they always learn from each other. Actually, what I'm saying is most of the renewal in the disciplines I know, they come from inspiration from other disciplines. Like Chomsky also learned from psychology and all kinds of other things. No one was doing that kind. Basically, most of the people who were doing these things did because we're learning from other disciplines. So that's a little bit of a history of discourse studies from the 60s, 70s, now more than 50 years. I can know because my own dissertation was 72, 50 years, more than 50 years ago, when I started to do something called text grammar, because until that time it was mostly sentence grammar. So we wanted to know, so we invented notions within linguistics which didn't even exist, like coherence, cohesion, and so on and so on. Many aspects of discourse were not even there in sentence grammar. Okay, so many of the new things we had to invent ourselves, because if you want to define something like discourse, notions like coherence come up, and how parts of discourse are structured. You know, like in a newspaper article, for example, you have headlines, a lead, and all kinds of other functional units in the text, and we simply started to invent things which in linguistics until that time did not even exist. So that was the 70s, and that is true until today, just more cooperation. Now within this whole field of discourse studies at the end of the 70s, and I have to emphasize that later, despite the cultural revolution of the 60s, the women's movement, feminist movement, the civil rights movement, despite all these social, political changes, did not really have influence in language studies, except sometimes in sociolinguistics. So it just came later. Whereas the people started to do all these things I just mentioned was, let's say, between the middle of the 60s and the middle of the 70s. All these studies, also in conversational analysis, text grammar, were between those times. Most of these studies about the structures of discourse, and a little bit of the mind, but practically no one about political stuff, like oppression, like racism, like sexism, like and so on. That just came later. Except maybe the one group which was already critical in the 70s was the classical university media group about bad news, more bad news, and so on, about the Falkland War and so on and so on. So they were there, but that at the end of the 70s, there was a book by Roger Fowler in England and a couple of other linguists, and they published a book called Language and Control. Now, that book actually is the beginning of critical discourse studies, and they called it critical linguistics. It was not yet critical discourse study because most of the structure they studied was still traditional grammatical structures, passive, active, normalization, and so on, this kind of thing. So at the end of the 70s, we had this book, Language and Control, which actually is the first step when linguistics, these were just linguists, were beginning to study also aspects of language use and discourse in a critical perspective. They say, yes, if you have this particular kind of structure in a text and it repeats it, it may favor the police. Because if the police is typically appearing in the first position of a sentence as a topic and as a subject and so on, of positive actions, then it sort of emphasizes. But if they are actors of negative actions, there is a tendency to put them at the end or even have them implicit in the text. So there are structures of grammar which somehow can emphasize or de-emphasize the social or political role of social actors like the police. Now these things were found in this book, Language and Control, and afterwards in many other studies we all did. So that's the beginning of critical discourse studies. So critical discourse studies also is in many disciplines. So you have critical discourse, for example, Ruth Warwick in Vienna, and afterwards also in Lancaster. And Norman Fairclough in Lancaster as well, was studying more and more also critical discourse studies from, for example, political point of view. Ruth Warwick was very much interested after her book on mothers and daughters, this more personal kind of thing, she was also very much interested in anti-Semitism. So much of the work of Ruth Wodak and applications we did later together also on racism in Europe, for example, how people in parliament were speaking about immigrants and so on. That was already of the 1980s. So it was not just critical linguistics, but more broadly critical discourse studies in different disciplines. At the same time, also, as an institution, things were changing. For example, we had new journals, which before we didn't have. So in the beginning of 1990, we had our first meeting as a group of people in Amsterdam. So Roger Fowler couldn't come, but Ruth Wodak was there, Teun van Leeuwen from Australia, Norman Fairclough. So there was a whole group of critical discourse people, now more than 30 years ago, together saying we are doing something which we call critical discourse studies, or discourse studies from a, let's say, socio-political perspective. That's what we did. Now that, of course, was very important, not only as a group, but also we, for the first time, had journals. So we founded the journal Discourse in Society, which I added until today. So we had all kinds of institutional things. We had programs at universities, what I now mentioned about different disciplines and so on, also came up in different universities. They had more and more program of discourses, not departments, but programs, yes, because they were between psychology and sociology and linguistics, anthropology, and so on. That was the main renewal then. Now, what is this critical discourse study? Many people also who send papers to our journals, they're saying we're going to apply critical discourse studies, or a method. One of the first things I would like to say today and emphasize today is there's no such thing as a method of critical discourse study. You cannot simply say, okay, I'm going to do critical discourse study and let's just apply it. It's not a method like content analysis or corpus linguistics, where people, count in a very sophisticated way frequencies and collocations of words and so on and so on. There's just one method. The method people use in critical discourse studies are methods in many. So you may have a specific kind of grammatical analysis, a specific kind of narrative analysis, or argumentation analysis, or maybe specific rhetorical structures, or maybe some stylistic things. So it's not one method. There is no such thing as a method of critical discourse study. You have many things, and even if you do narrative analysis, within narrative analysis, you have at least 20 different kinds of narrative analysis. You could look at actors and their roles, but also on the plot, like they used to do many times before. There are many other things of narrative you can study. It's not just one method. So if, for example, you're going to interview people on the street and you want to know, for example, then, as we did in Amsterdam, their opinion about immigrants in the neighborhood, you listen to their stories and you do a narrative analysis of these stories, which is a very different kind of narrative when people, for example, ask about the experiences of the last war. So each object of analysis requires different kind of methods, and it's just one method. So that's very important. The main aspect to identify critical discourse studies has to do with the fact that you are interested not primarily in linguistic structures, like I just mentioned, including narrative, argumentative, stylistic, rhetorical, and so structures, but some kind of dimension important in the world, like, for example, power and power abuse. So how is domination or power abuse applied and expressed in discourse? When prime ministers talk, when the police talks, or when immigrants talk, how does this particular kind of power abuse or resistance against power abuse work? So most of the early studies also of Ruth Wodak about anti-Semitism, my own work in the 80s about racism, and Norman Fairclough, for example, about political discourse in England and so on. Most of the early work in critical discourse study was about power abuse and domination. How does it show up in text and talk at all these levels I just mentioned? But then in the 90s, more and more, we also started to think, yes, but critical discourse study is not just about domination and power abuse. It also has to do with resistance. For example, if you want to study feminist discourse, it obviously has to do with resistance, with opposition, and so on and so on. So one newer kind of critical discourse studies after 2000 is mostly also about how discourses are resistant against this form of domination and power abuse. And actually, even that particular kind of resistance is not always there. So people also may be interested in things like empathy, solidarity. All right, so you may have a resistance movement, for example, like the feminist movement, and you can do this kind of feminist discourse analysis, as does, for example, Michelle Azar in Singapore. She has a book on feminist critical discourse studies. It's still a form of resistance. But if you want to study, for example, how people talk about refugees and go and help refugees, as happened in many countries in Western Europe, that is not about resistance, it's not about opposition, it's not about domination, but it's about solidarity. So you have, I began, for example, in my later work, to read books I had never even touched or seen or known before, about books about empathy or about solidarity. I had no idea that in the social sciences, for example, there's a whole library on books on solidarity. I had no idea. So how exactly do you define solidarity, and how can you show this in discourse, and not only in discourse, but also in the mind? Because my way of looking at these things is a little bit different from my colleagues, who in general relate all structures of discourse I just mentioned with all kinds of structures of society also mentioned, like opposition, domination, exclusion, and so on and so on. But I also am very much interested, because of this work in the 70s I did with a psychologist in the United States, Walter Kinch, who died last year. When we did a book called Strategies of Discourse Comprehension, we wanted to know what are strategies in the mind and so on. I always said the way discourse is related to society always goes through here. The only way social structures can influence the way we talk and write is when we interpret the social structures. So they have to go through an interpretation in our minds, and that interpretation on the mind can relate to the structures of discourse in our mind. There, the interface is here. There is no direct relationship between discourse structures and social structures. You always have to have this kind of interface, and that is a position I defend here today, and I've been defending for a long time, not all people accept. Many people in the social science, as I just mentioned, don't even want to talk about cognition, because cognition is individual, is not social, which I think is a very limited idea of society, because society is also what people think, and how people think. And how can you avoid talking about ideology and the knowledge of epistemic communities? You cannot talk about society without also talking about what happens here. So you always have at least a triangle between discourse structures, or language structures, discourse structures, in all its complexity, social political structures on the other side, and always mediated through what happens here. Forms of interpretation, understanding, and so on. Structures of knowledge is here, ideologies are here. Okay, so it is crucial, this kind of thing. Just a few more words about this kind of critical discourse studies. I said we are specifically interested in domination, power abuse, and resistance against this particular kind of thing, or empathy or solidarity with people who resist. Which can be minorities, can be women, immigrants, poor people, and so on and so on. Our way of analyzing discourse about them or of them So discourse about refugees or of refugees, again, there's different kind of perspective. You know, it's either some kind of resistance or some kind of solidarity, empathy, and so all these structures. So one PhD thesis could be, what are the empathetic structures in the discourses of people helping refugees? You know, this kind of thing. Okay. Another thing, since I talked about this cognitive stuff, like for example, ideologies, well, you know, and we'll talk about that in my next talk, a little bit more about the structure of ideology, but basically, if I already summarize very quickly, ideologies have to do with in-groups and out-groups. It's us and them, as it's also shown in the pronouns, us and them. And this kind of polarization in the basic ideological structure also applies in all kinds of social attitudes about immigration, about abortion, about gay marriage, about euthanasia, and so on. These things apply there. And finally, also they show up in discourse. So this polarized structures in discourse shows up at all levels of discourse. Let me just give you a couple of examples. For example, if you want to study authority, you can, for example, just look at the phonology and phonetics of how people talk. For example, shouting of police officers. You know, sound is one of these kind of things. I just mentioned a few structures where you have, for example, and people who are resisting maybe, you know, whispering and not in the same way shouting. It's also in typical feminist studies of male chauvinist way of men talking to women, you know, shouting and so on. So that's just one aspect, the phonetics and the phonology, etc. In grammar, I just mentioned, for example, the book Knowledge and Control of Fowler and others at the end of the 70s. They already were interested in the grammatical structure, for example, in nominalization, how you make nouns of verbs. For example, instead of say, for example, the police are discriminating, so on, so you can say the discrimination of the police, or simply not mention the police. So you can reduce the way actors are displayed in text by a passive construction or a normalization. So that is the kind of thing. And if you do a systematic study of the media talking about immigration, for example, you will find all these polarized structures, and emphasis basically is like this: emphasizing our good things and emphasizing their bad things. And also, because it's scholarly, de-emphasizing our bad things, like denial of racism, and de-emphasizing their good things. So if immigrants contribute to the economy, you won't find it emphasized in headlines, in first words, in many important consonants. So there's a way of doing this at all levels of text and talk. In the phonology, in the structure of sentences, in superstructures, as you call the typical structures of discourse, like for example, an introduction in an article, a summary, an abstract, a conclusion, these things of categories of discourse, which are more global structures in discourse. You can emphasize things by putting it in a headline or not. Again, it depends how you emphasize specific kinds of things. You can do it, for example, in argumentation. You have many types of analysis in our field. This is on argumentation. There's a whole library of there are journals about that. But if you do a systematic study of fallacies, analyzing, for example, how Western European governments talk about immigration, that is a very nice way of how people sort of manipulate argumentation and so on. So each aspect of emphasizing our good things and de-emphasizing our bad things, especially our racism, is one of these typical things people do. In narrative, you can have biased storytelling. You know, you have not only fake news, but you also have fake storytelling. You know, stories which are told about, you know, and I interviewed people in Amsterdam and also in California about their neighborhood, and they told stories. And it was interesting, how do people stories about all these Mexicans in the neighborhood, or in Amsterdam, all these Turks in the neighborhood? Same here. So I was interested in the narrative structure of these kind of things. What else? Of course, in pragmatics, interested specifically in speech acts. What kind of speech act do what kind of people use? If police officers say stop and so on, is that an order or an invitation? You know, you want to know what kind of this, and it has to do also with politeness. So many aspects which are typically studied in, for example, pragmatics, like speech act, politeness, and so on, also has to do especially with the relationship between me and others. It has to do with politeness, has to do with the power of the other people. And if the other people have more power, or only use more polite forms like vous and not tu, and usted in Spanish, and so even the choice of pronouns already gives you an idea about the relationship between me and other people. So that's about pragmatics. And of course, style. And so we can do, each level of discourse analysis has these kind of typical things of doing analysis, which shows the ideological polarization between us and them, emphasizing our good things at all levels of discourse, and of course in semantics too. So if you want to describe how good we are and how tolerant Europe is, receiving all these immigrants and so on, and of course, that also needs in the semantic analysis on how we are being described ourselves and how others are being described. And sometimes, especially, it's not so explicit, so you want to know about implications and presupposition, all kinds of stuff, which is very important, which you cannot see, and therefore you cannot count with content analysis, but content analysis can only count what you can see. So in semantics, you have meanings, local and global ones, etc., etc. So this is, of course, very important. And, of course, rhetoric. Just another aspect of discourse structures. And, of course, you have all kinds of, if I'm saying, emphasizing their bad things and our good thing, any kind of analysis of emphasizing is rhetorical analysis. It is hyperbolic expressions, or the other way, euphemisms. You know, for example, I remember in the 80s doing this particular kind of analysis, people, would defend things like, for example, racism. There's not racism in our country, there was lack of popular support of, this kind of thing. So there were ways of describing racism in euphemistic terms. That's just one aspect. The words you choose to describe our negative stuff, all right? So again, this is very important. And I forget what today is one of the most interesting developments in discourse analysis, multimodal analysis of images, movies, body movement, any kind, embodied kinds of stuff and so on. So we began with Saussure 100 years ago with words as signs, signifiant, signifier, and so on, and in grammar and so on, and it gets more and more and more and more complex. And today, people like Theo van Leeuwen in Australia and many other people in other countries are studying not just the text and word, but also, especially now with social media, lots of images and their structures and the sophisticated analysis of images we had no idea about even 50 years ago. Well, a little bit in the history of art. Yes, but now more sophisticated. Now, to apply this, let me just tell a little bit more about what I'm doing now. Because there's a little bit of history to give you an idea. I think anyone here in the social sciences who hasn't done it, there is a lot of things in discourse analysis from a multidisciplinary, not just grammar, all these other things like narrative and argumentation and rhetoric and style and many other aspects of discourse, also multimodal. Now you can apply in stuff in the social sciences. Then I also said my way of doing it is more like a triangle, not just relating discourse structures with social structure, because there is no direct relation. It is methodologically wrong. It's impossible because social structures are very different. The structure of power is very different from the structure of a pronoun. So to relate this, you know to go here. Therefore, this necessity of doing also ideological analysis or epistemic analysis or opinion analysis. doxastic analysis, and so they're different kinds of things. So this is the way I think you should relay these particular kind of things. Then, working for many years about racist discourse, and then also saying it's not just about domination, but also about resistance, I did some books on anti-racist discourse and its history. You know, when did people start to resist slavery? Already 2,000 years ago, and how did they do that? And then through the whole history, there's always the discourses of abolition, of resistance, and so on. Already 500 years ago, 300 years ago, so most of these slaveries were abolished in the 19th century, and you can find it. So I did a study of history until Black Lives Matter, how people resist this particular kind of thing called racism, all right? And I did also the same thing for Brazil, where I often go. My wife is from Brazil. I go there very often. I did a book also about the history of anti-racist discourse in Brazil and how there also it was applied to abolition and so on. Now, what I'm interested in to finish today is this. More and more, when I was doing all these different kind of things, of discourse study, political discourse analysis, forms of resistance, like the history also of critical discourse, of anti-racist discourse, I more and more was interested in the discourse of social movements. So I already had studied anti-racist social movements, so I already knew a little bit about it. I was reading, for example, the text of Black Lives Matter, and many other feminist movements as well, and green movements, and so on and so on. Now I was interested in how does this work? Now what happens is, if you go to the social sciences, reading about social movements, what is the notion they typically use to study all these texts and talk? The notion they use is frames and frame analysis. And I wonder, what exactly is this kind? People also in the media, many people in the media have been doing frame analysis since many years. I always wondered what actually is this kind of frame analysis. So what I did is I gathered more than 100 articles about frame analysis, and I said, oh, let me study what it is. Now I found out that it was about nothing. Anything they didn't have names for, they called it frame. It could be narrative, argument, it could be the grammar, it could be the lexicon, it would style, rhetoric, whatever we have things studied for 50, 60, 80 years, they called frames. So this can't be true. It's a method which can be studied, anything can be, so I did an analysis called analyzing frame analysis. And I invited people in this field of the social sciences, and it was a very critical study, because they said, listen, if you want to study all these kind of things, why don't you open a book of discourse analysis or of social analysis applied to this? No. So it was just all frames. So my critical study, and then I invited them, and a special issue of last year is about this particular kind of frame analysis. Now, and then someone said, yes, you can be criticizing all these things. What would you do? Good question. So I felt sort of motivated to say, now let me do something like that. So I started to write a book a few years ago, and it's called Social Movement Discourse. Okay, I'm going to study social movement, and I'm going to show how you can do a discourse analysis of social movement, and that's it. It's basically an introduction for people in social sciences about how to do an analysis of movement. And the movement I studied was the movement of refugees welcome. Was started in 2015, people coming to Austria, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, England, so many people coming, and I wanted to know people talking about this particular kind of thing, how they do that. What kind of basic discourse do they have? What kind of manifest do they read? Or when people, for example, interviewing, like a colleague of mine in England did, Pierre Montfort, a French guy. He, with his colleagues, interviewed women who went to France to help refugees, and he has more than 150 interviews, and I could use many of them. And we started to look at how do women, mostly women, not only women, talk about this helping refugees. And as a linguist, one very quickly looks at things which are always there. And one of the typical notions typically used by these women was just. Just, you know, a word like just. I was just helping. It was just by coincidence. They had a way of talking about their action not as big heroes, but as some kind of modest people. We are just ordinary people. And we started to study systematically how women helping refugees use a simple word like just. And we did a paper about that, also published in some kind of journal of refugee studies. So you can study how people express specific kinds of things, which gives you an idea about how they think about these kind of things. And I called it doing modesty. It's doing modesty. You do modesty by using this kind of just. Different from big guys who just say how big heroes they are. And they actually say, I'm no big hero. Okay? So you see how you can study one aspect of discourse applied to this. Now, one of the typical, what is the most typical discourse of a social movement? I would say a manifesto. A manifesto. If you have a new movement, what you do, you write a manifesto. Actually, in my other book on social, about anti-racism, I began to analyze, for example, manifesto of Black Lives Matter. Now, what I did today, and we have a few minutes to have a look at this, in the example. So to analyze one of these, the many texts of social movements, you have, you know, slogans, you have manifestos, you have graffiti, and so social movements use many kinds of discourse. One of the fundamental things is this. Now, if you have a look at this movement in Spain called Stop Mare Mortum, which is obvious from its half Latin title, you see that it has, of course, a summary of what they actually do, Stop Mare Mortum, and to stop dead people dead at sea. And if you do an analysis of this text, and that is interesting. So look, for example, line 2, for example, gives you all kinds of slogans like awareness, political advocacy, and population monument. That's the summary of what they actually do and mean. It's like any headline in a newspaper as well, it gives you a summary. But what then follows, if you do an analysis which is not just a grammatical analysis, or not even a discourse analysis, the kind of analysis is what I sometimes call an analysis of relevance. So I'm going to find in this text units, categories, which have to do typically with the structure of a social movement. There's nothing in grammar which is that, but if you look, for example, who are we? Which has to do with identity, right? So apparently, one of the first things of a social movement is identity. And then, we are a citizen platform that aims to promote change, etc. Again, it's the definition of who are we? It's a response to the rhetorical question. So identity is a very important thing. And then, that aims to promote. Aims is the purpose. So social movements have an identity, and aims and goals is a very important aspect of a social movement. It's part of its definition. That's why it's part of the manifesto. Then we put a migration, immigration policy in order to ensure that human rights and so on. So we have actually an immediate goal and a goal which is there to reach another goal. So you have to do a different kind of goal analysis for social movements. It is here in the structure of the text. And then that human rights are guaranteed and respected. Now, another thing is, for example, norms and values. So it's not only what we need, but also what we have to defend and so on. Now, the interesting thing is, if you do, we don't have time, because I don't want to talk too much, I want also people have questions. If you do this kind of relevance analysis of this text, you find the typical category of a social movement, identity. Who are we? And its definition. What are our games? Who are our enemies? For example, they are against, for example, the European governments who don't want, etc. So we're, etc., etc. We have norms and values. Now the interesting thing is, and I will talk about it, I may talk afterwards about the structure of ideology. If you do a systematic analysis of structures of ideology here as they show up in all kinds of discourses, the structure of an ideology looks like the structure of this kind of manifesto. It is identity, actions, the other group, norms and values, and so on. All the typical categories of an ideology show up in this text. So what you have here, a manifesto can be defined, according to this kind of thing, as a discursive expression of an ideology. And it is happened. I have found it for several. I did an article also published in a book on different kind of manifestos of different movements in the world. And it's very often is like this. Of course, don't forget that the structure of a discourse is not the same thing as a structure of the mind. A discourse has all the structures of text and talk and so on, of language. Like all its grammatical structure and argumentation structure and so on, the mind is different. The structure of an ideology here is not exactly, but some kind of categories of the ideology, like us and them, what we want and our objective and how bad the others are, shows up here. That's all I want to say today. Thank you. I'm sure you have many, many questions, but we only have 15 minutes. Okay. So, if any question? As I said, it's more introductory for many people who don't know, but it gives you an idea about how discourse analysis started in the 60s, 70s, how then at the end of the 70s also people began to do more critical stuff, beginning grammar, but then other disciplines. More and more multimodal and so on. Today, more and more sophisticated methods like corpus linguistics and so on, which is much more complicated than, for example, content analysis. And then not only questions of how power and power abuses manifest in the discourses of powerful people and institutions, but also how people resist these particular kinds of things, and that you can also study. All right, and then from my perspective also, don't forget also the cognitive stuff. Like, for example, you could just do an analysis of the epistemic structure of text, only that. So how does knowledge express, presupposed, and so on in discourse? So it's just knowledge. So you see how the structure of knowledge are related to epistemic communities. Again, we are in sociology. All right. So again, always all these things go together. More complex, and more it explains more. Just don't only do that. So if people say cognitive analysis is not social, get it? It's wrong, because cognition is extremely valuable also in social analysis. But now you ask questions, please. You have to shout because I'm half deaf and I'm literally an old man, so sometimes you have to shout. Or there's a microphone. Just a second.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so my question is that you are contrasting the discourse analysis and content analysis. Like content analysis is basically counting of things that you already know, but can you do it like first analyze the discourse and find some concrete things and then quantitatively count them?
Okay, fair enough. I am not saying that content analysis is useless. I'm only saying if you don't do more than that, that is very limiting. And if you want to count, because you have, for example, you study social media and you have 10,000 texts, obviously you cannot do a detailed analysis of the grammar of all these texts, right? So you have to do something quantitative, and then either, as you say, you find specific kinds of things like the word just I just mentioned, and then look them up in the data of 150 interviews, which is a lot of text, and they say, how often is this particular word being used, and then you count them. And so you may start, as you say, with something which, because of qualitative analysis, you think that must be interesting. Let's now see how often that appears. That's one thing. Only today we don't have only content analysis, which only does the coding of explicit stuff, but also the implicit stuff and many other things. And today we, of course, we have corpus linguistics, which does content analysis in a more sophisticated way, because you not only look at frequency of words or expressions, but also how they combine with others, adverse position. Let's say, okay, where they begin, let's say at the end of a sentence, beginning of a sentence. It's more a way of combining more sophisticated linguistic analysis with cognitive, with content analysis, and that will be corpus linguistics, which also gets more and more sophisticated. But it's only still counting words. You don't do yet a more qualitative analysis of the structure of a whole proposition. Who is actually the actor of, for example, a negative stuff? You cannot see that in quantitative. You have to combine it with qualitative analysis. So if you do a more sophisticated content analysis today, for example, in corpus linguistics, there are many introductions to this particular kind of method, and so that obviously combine. And as you just say, yes, you can begin with an observation in a qualitative analysis. Now let me see how often that appears and where and how. Of course, yes. Other questions? Someone? I just walk to you so that I understand you better. Yes, yes. This kind of question comes up always when you do discourse analysis in general, critical discourse analysis in particular. It's perspective. I would say that to do an honest critical discourse analysis, you make explicit what the norms, values, aims, methods, and so are. So, for example, you can say in a quantitative analysis, this word appears 502 times. There's no question about bias, it's just there, of course. But as soon as you interpret what you have counted and so on, then again it's a little bit different. So you say, from a perspective of, let's say, this particular kind of ideology, for example, if you are a feminist and say, okay, my ideology is a feminist ideology, and this is how I see, for example, oppression of women by men, and this is the way I'm going to do this particular kind of analysis, and I call it a feminist critical discourse analysis. Fair enough. Now, if you are on, you know, as we talk in the talk afterwards, if you are at the extreme right, you say, okay, my perspective is illiberal and so on, and my view of this kind of thing, I think it's honest to say my perspective is so and such, and this has this and this kind of influence on the way I do this. So a good critical analysis, in my view, is that you make explicit what your theories is, what your ideology is. So when I do, as I did, books on anti-racist discourse, of course, so my view is I am an anti-racist, and this ideology of anti-racist is this kind of thing, and it has this particular kind of analysis, and it has this kind of, as soon as you're very explicit about your analysis, they can say, I don't like it, but they cannot say it's not true. Because you say, okay, this and this kind of word appears there, this and this kind of narrative structure is there, this and this kind of fallacy and argumentation is there. if we all agree about the basic categories of discourse, you cannot just deny and so on. You can simply say, I don't agree. You can say, I'm not like that. But so the notion of bias has to do what kind of ideology is behind that. A feminist one or a male chauvinist one and so on. So you have to make them explicit. And then people very often won't even accept you then still. But that's of course their problem. But you have to be explicit about your principles, you know, and about the ideology you have and so on and so on. Are there other questions? And here too. Just come closer so I see you more.
Now, yeah. Okay, it doesn't. Okay, whatever. So I have a question.
No, speak for
I
others.
don't think it works. Well, let's give it a try. So I want to ask you about political science. So I'm from the field of international relations, and I feel like that in that field we have seen like a very prominent pattern since 1990s that you have this critical discourse scholarship, which is essentially qualitative, and then of course a lot of quantitative text analysis, especially later. I wonder if you see some space for like a merger of these disciplines, where you have more and more quantitative, a little bit going in the direction of the previous question of my colleague. So especially in connection with the large language models and with these novel developments, it seems to me there is a big area, big gap in the research where you can apply this kind of, let's say, theoretical interest in critical discourse analysis with essentially quantitative methods.
Yes.
We have a fairly good experience with using generative AI and the large language models for actually detecting relatively nuanced kind of textual features, like way beyond like counting words, literally getting at the meaning of sentences.
Yes.
In basically replicating human coding, to put it very bluntly. So I would be interested in any comments that you might have on this kind of possible new fields to emerge.
I did expect a little bit a question about AI and about these language models, about which many linguists, as Chomsky himself also, are very critical. But they say, okay, they're based on millions of texts, and they are based on this particular. It's like very sophisticated copying of billions of texts, and then okay. I give you one example. Happened to be a few weeks ago. I was in Switzerland, giving a talk, and my new future book will be about social movement cognition. My last book is about social movement discourse, and I am going to apply that to another social movement, namely the anti-militarist movement, the pacifist movement. And then I took a page from a big arms company, Lockheed Martin in the United States, and what I did is, now let me ask ChatGPT about what that particular company thinks about things like the environment. So I asked that, and before I did an analysis of the actual page from the website of Lockheed Martin, I asked ChatGPT to write that one. It was amazing. It was exactly the same thing. So it was as if the language models are based on lots of this is the way you do it, and okay. So yes, we are learning all kinds of things, and of course, if one of the notions I introduced many years ago is the notion of semantic macrostructures. It is the idea of the global meaning of a text. It's not the meaning of a word or a sentence, but the global meaning, and you see it expressed in headlines, leads, conclusions, and so on. And to do that, I wrote a whole book about it, macrostructure in 1980, and so on. And if you now, that particular kind of notion also define summaries of text. Now, what I'm interested in is whether or not these long language models somehow apply these notions, not at all. So they're not a qualitative analysis, they simply take a million texts and just imitate them, and that's what they produce. It is very much similar to what we find, but it's not exactly the same thing. I can show and prove that it's not a real summary, and so on. So certain kind of things, not only, for example, corpus linguistics stuff, but also other kinds of things I don't dominate, like LDA or this kind of models, which is also based on meaning, based on frequencies and so on. Again, I have to say, you can show and prove that it's not really an analysis on the basis of the meaning of the words, meaning of the sentences in terms of propositions and so on, but it's simply frequencies and so on, and you can show that it gives you a pretty good idea, yes. In the same way as a frequency analysis of words being used, many of the articles they send us to our journals, if you have a sophisticated analysis, you get a pretty good idea what texts are all about, but it's not the same thing. And if Chomsky says so-and-so, this is very bad, and so he's right in that respect, it's fundamentally different from the qualitative analysis. What I am interested in, whether these models which are being developed now and which are very sophisticated and very impressive, what their background and implications are. Is it just because they sound very convincing, or is it they're really based on understanding of the text they analyze? And I do think they don't understand a thing. It's like to use an exaggerated, it's a hyperbolic expression. They're very sophisticated copying machines, but very sophisticated ones. They don't understand actually what they're reading or writing, but they simply copy it. When you give, I want to have part of a website of Lockheed Martin, they will produce something which is very similar, but not because of the structures, but because they have seen 1 million of these texts, 1 million companies. But of course, this is just a minute talking about it. It needs much more analysis, much more discussion, and I'm, as anyone else, fascinated about what these models can do. I mean, of course, I'm impressed, but still, what I know after 50 years of doing discourse analysis, it's not what we need. It functions, it can apply it all the time, and if I see many texts also of students, it usually functions at the level of the first or second year. If a PhD student of mine would write it, I wouldn't let it pass, because then the details are simply wrong. You see what I'm saying? So if they are learning and they but today, many of these texts they write, also about political stuff and so on, and sometimes, for all kinds of practical reasons, even for my new book, say, oh, what are the main movements in Australia today? Boom. I can find it also in Google, but I mean, so yes, I'm impressed, but also critically impressed. But thank you for the question, because we have to reply today too. You had a...
less question about the text analysis or with the text, but rather the relationship between the discourse and power.
Yes.
While dealing with critical discourse analysis, whether and how should we deal with the other means of power? I mean, for example, while analyzing, let's say, some power group and its discourse. So whether and how should I take other means of power this group has into the consideration?
Give me an example.
Let's say I will analyze discourse of, I don't know, Ukrainian government.
Of whom?
Of government of Ukraine, and they have also other means of power, especially let's say arms or weapons while being involved with Russia.
Yeah.
And should I take this into consideration while analyzing the discourse of the Ukrainian government, for example, or it could be a political party and the financialization of political party.
Okay. Again, the link between discourse and power is extremely huge, and therefore always needs more detailed analysis. It's not just power and discourse, it is some aspects of power. So you need a social political analysis of power on the one hand. In the same way, you need a discourse analysis in detail the discourse side. So it's just like this. So for example, what's the relation between a headline in a newspaper and something else? You know, this kind of thing. So first of all, I make a distinction, a very important, between power and power abuse. So if I'm talking about the relation of the beginning of critical discourse study was not about power in general, but about forms of power abuse, forms of domination. And it could be political domination, but it can also be cultural domination, it can be educational domination in schools, and so on and so on. There are many kinds of abuse of power, of men over women, teachers over students, and so on and so on. And then depends on the relation of, it needs an analysis of the context where it is being used, and so on and so on. To do this particular kind of analysis, you need a detailed analysis, what kinds of power relationships are involved, in which respect there are forms of abuse of power, and then see how in the discourse of these people, these power relationships are somehow come up in the grammar, the argumentation, in the narrative, in the rhetoric, in the style, and so on. Do they use particular kind of words, like the Nazis use this particular kind of words of demeaning Jews, for example? But just words. But it can also be in all kinds of things. Like, for example, if you want to mitigate that we are discriminating, one of the things you can do it is, for example, mitigating our actor role and say, okay, there is lots of discrimination in the country without saying who is who. All right? So you need a detailed analysis of the kind of powers involved, all kinds of power, an analysis of the social and political context, and then you also begin to do a different analysis of the discourses and can show, people can put you in prison, people can also delegitimize you, for example, as immigrants, by saying immigrants take away our jobs, and so on and so on. So there are many ways you can discriminate the groups, not only killing them, discriminating them, putting them in prison, or eliminating many, and so on. But I'm interested in how that is happening in all kinds of forms of text and talk. And how this particular power is, an abuse of power, is produced and reproduced through its public discourses. For example, in the media, or in public discourses, or in debate in parliament, and so on. So one of my students, for example, did an analysis of how one conservative party in Spain was talking about immigrants and how to reduce immigration. All right? And a paper I'm going to talk about after this is about, for example, how electoral programs in different countries write about different kinds of things like immigration and so on. So there's ways of doing analysis, but you need always a detailed analysis. One kind is like socio-political analysis, and a detailed discourse analysis, and again, always through what happens here. So what kind of cognition is involved? What kind of ideology is involved? What kind of knowledge is presupposed here? What kind of opinions are expressed? What are the norms and values, and so on, like the question she had about bias. So the analysis is not just simplistic, it needs more and more and more sophisticated qualitative analysis, and always yes, questions of, if necessary, count, of course. It's obviously also very important. And if you have, as many of my students also do today, more and more, if you have 10,000 TikTok texts and so on, then you may have to count stuff and not just do qualitative analysis. See what I'm saying? So it's not just power and discourse, it's much more detailed. You have to go not just coding, but just to have a deep analysis of both things. Are there other questions?
Thank you. I would like to ask, I'm a great admirer of your work since my PhD dissertation, since I've built up on it, a part of it. And I'm combining, I heard what you said about frame analysis, but I am combining CDA with frame analysis for quite a long time. So I was quite curious about the special issue. It was the special issue of discourse studies
Yes.
last year.
Yes. You will have to go to internet yourself to see the contents of that particular issue. I mean, there's several people, and I invited people in different disciplines, in sociology, in linguistics, in cognitive science, anyone who has been doing frame analysis in different disciplines, I invited to contribute the paper from their own perspective. And in principle, please, if you can, comment on my very critical paper. It's a very critical, detailed paper. It says, okay, this and this and this, and the summary of the paper is very simple. If you study any kind of discourse or text, and you describe it with frames, what I'm saying is, and I'm showing that each of these 150 papers describes something different. And they call it all frames. How can that be? It's like anything of language use? Of course not. So, okay, if you as a sociologist want your data, your corpus is some kind of text or talk, well, why don't you open a book of discourse analysis, for example? The same thing, not only that, but if, for example, you study culture, open a book of anthropology. You know, I have to stimulate people not to stay, and I just said, most of the new things happen at the border with other disciplines. What I hope to stimulate this last book is say, okay, if you do frames, a frame analysis, you have to define what it is. So if a frame is some kind of a summary of something, like what is, emphasized, but I say, you can 20 different ways to emphasize something in a text. With bigger letters, with photographs, with expressions like hyperbolistic expression, with rhetoric, with semantics. There are many ways to emphasize something. It's not just one thing. Okay, I just have to be a specialist. But in the same way, if I'm going to study something about refugees, the first thing I do, like now for my new book, I'm reading at least a year about what about this movement of pacifism, anti-militarism. I'm not going to. I first have to know, and most of these studies have nothing to do with discourse analysis. You always go to another discipline first, and then you can contribute something. And the frame analysis, not only in social movement studies, but also in media analysis, is very famous. It is simply a very critical, pseudo way of doing discourse analysis, and it is not, because it's all the same. And I showed it in more than 150 articles. Okay? Everyone is using something different. How can that be a frame?
Yeah, but on the other hand, it could be also the issue of discourse analysis, because people also say that they are doing critical discourse analysis and it is not defined as another discourse analysis. So it's always a question of.
That's not the same thing, because if people say language and going to study this aspect of the language, if they're doing frame analysis, the kind of frame I'm going to use is, for example, rhetorical expressions of emphasis, then I have no problem. You can, of course, call them all frame, but you have to define what it is. And then you need discourse analysis. You cannot say, in the same way as I would not accept someone I'm going to do critical discourse analysis, and they don't do anything like that, just they call it, because they study discourse, they call it, and they are critical, they call it critical discourse. Of course it is not. In the same way, I would criticize also critical discourse analysis, which is not doing exactly what discourse analysis is all about, of course. And we have had that not only frame analysis, but many other kinds of analysis. Yes, of course. You always have to be very critical also about our own stuff. That's why I began saying critical discourse analysis is not a method. It's more a perspective or a way of seeing things. It's not a method of analysis. It's just a perspective. One more. Christy, you have to say when we have to stop.
I would like to ask you about the discourse analysis of image, as you talked about during the first part. Is it possible to, because images are becoming more and more important, as we can see on the social media, and I would like to ask you if you're doing the CDS of images. Is it like some kind of difference between the textual analysis and the images, or if there's like challenges we must face, which we must be aware of when we're doing the image analysis?
What happens now? It's not my field. I mean, the funny thing. Yes, I know. There are people doing critical multimodal discourse analysis who do analysis. Multimodal is not just the text, but also the images or sounds and so on. It can be a song and so on and so on. So they have analysis of images, and you can say the way of, of this perspective or this move of this photograph and so on, or the colors being used, or the way there are many, in the same way you have many structures of discourse, you have many structures of images. Up, on top, on the left, on the right, the colors, use of colors, forms, more or less abstract, and so all these things may have meaning. And they can also be biased. You can represent negative immigrants just by taking very specific kind of images. Okay, so critical multimodal discourse analysis does that, and many people doing this kind of thing. And again, the person I admire most in this field is a Dutch guy who works already many years in Australia called Teun A. And Teun A does this particular kind of thing, for example, about legitimation or about immigration. And his last book is also about ideology and interpretation, this particular kind of thing. And so he gives also actually a picture, I think it's a picture of someone in front or next to a tank, I think in Budapest. And he says something about how that picture implies this and this particular kind of thing. It's very sophisticated. Again, we do since Aristotle or longer 2,000 years of discourse analysis in rhetoric and poetics and so on. We are very sophisticated about text and talk and language. Not even complete, but we know a lot. I don't think we have the same sophistication for images. If he says, my interpretation of this publicity photograph is typical neoliberal so-and-so, well, it reminds me as if I did poetry analysis when I was a student. It's like interpretation. So there, people can say, yes, that's your interpretation, but he is sophisticated and says, no, we know that this particular kind of color has this particular kind of implication. And if you also know about the cognitive stuff of interpreting or the influence of colors and so on, so again, it's multidisciplinary. So this kind of work goes on, and there are journals of semiotics, journals of visual communication. Our own journals also publish many of these things. And in my own book, I have a whole chapter on the multi-discourse analysis of social movements, and I analyze a picture of a demonstration. And what you can see in the picture and what you cannot see and so on, and how people look and many other things you wouldn't even think about when you do discourse analysis. So, but I was just a beginner in that chapter because I'm not a specialist neither in narrative analysis or argumentation analysis or grammatical analysis. I'm not a specialist in any of these things. I just try to get them together. And there is a chapter there and much more interesting work of people like Theo van Leeuwen and many others, David Matchin and so on, who do this particular kind of critical multimodal analysis, typically now of all the work on social media, of course. Yes. You have to stop when one more. You're the last one.
Thank you again for the lecture. I just wanted to ask if you could the difference when linguists and non-linguists do work under the CDA paradigm, because it feels to me that there is still a significant gap in terms of results, what kind of phenomena they discuss, especially when they don't combine CDA, but if they really work within the CDA paradigm, meaning they do textual analysis. But obviously they look for different stuff, and also in the results they tend to discuss linguistic phenomena if they're linguists, or the socio-economic, socio-political phenomena if they are non-linguists. And especially in the area of publishing, that becomes a problem, because there the interdisciplinarity doesn't really work, because it might
I understand, and I'm not going to defend now publishers, whether or not they should not. I am not sure. It is difficult because most of the students who go study also, let's say here, political science, they will have 99% of the studies political science and not going to study something like cognition or cognitive analysis. If at all, it will be a little bit. And it happens in all disciplines. Linguists only do this particular kind of thing and don't look in psychology, well, a little bit maybe when it has to be the cognitive linguistic study of language. But basically, most disciplines study only this particular kind of thing. So if you now have a PhD student and you want to say, okay, why don't you, and then you invite them to also, as I said, open a book in discourse analysis or a sociological study or a psychological study or an anthropological study, and so on and so on. That is true. But I'm not saying that it is possible. For example, when I started to do the work with Walter Kinch in the United States in the 70s about the strategies of discourse comprehension, I entered that field as a linguist. Well, actually, I began as a study in literary studies. My first study as a student was about French surrealist poetry. I was studying Paul Éluard. It had nothing to do with what I do now. So, and through that, I came to linguistics more and more, and so I studied. So when I started to do this work with a psychologist who did experiments, he brought his idea about processes and experiments, and my idea. And actually, that book and our first article was cited more than any other. So some of these things which are between disciplines are doing very well. And what I now hope, that my new book, just published now in London at Routledge, I hope this new book will be not read in linguistics because they know about discourse analysis, but specifically people working on social movements in the social sciences. And I hope they have a look extra at text and talk as they didn't before. Yes, it can be done. And many of these books between disciplines function well. But it's true that of beginning student, I cannot expect in the social sciences that he or she also knows about linguistics and about sociology and about anthropology and about communication and so on. No, but what I do is that if you then enter to your PhD, which is my main work, also the center I direct in Barcelona, basically educating PhD students, and I said, oh, try it. And he was there also visiting in Barcelona. Read something else which is and combine it, what you know about political science, with something about discourse analysis, and so on. And so it is difficult, but at the level of a PhD, you have 4 or 5 years, you can read something extra, and not only in your own field. I mean, and you will see that you can then start to see in your own disciplines which before you didn't see. It happens with me all the time. As I said, I begin doing analysis of poetry. And then suddenly I began to do, in the 60s, analysis of linguistics, especially semantics. And my first very primitive studies started doing semantic analysis of poetry. That was already one step outside of literature and inside of linguistics. And then later say, but what happens in the semantic kind of stick is also something here. And there's something about cognition, and then I learned another. That is a step. You don't have to dominate it all at the same time, but it can be done. And just open another book. It always will help you. And especially if you only stay in your own discipline, it is very unlikely you find something very, very new. But that's my experience. It's in many disciplines, I think. Always being critical. What do you think?
I think we can have a coffee break and then we can go.
Okay.
Series, and I hope you will enjoy it as much as you did, hopefully, the first one. So yes, please allow me to welcome Professor Van Dijk for the second time, in this case, for a lecture that will be focused on the reactionary right. Thank you very much.
Jan, thanks again for this invitation to be here to talk about our work in critical discourse studies in general, and especially also my more recent work, and therefore much less sophisticated work on the extreme right, ideologies, and so on. The topic is very relevant today anywhere also. Of course, before I came here, I said, let me read what's happening here. You have here a party with the same abbreviation as the Social Democrats in Germany, the SPD, and so on. And I wanted to know what to do. But my analysis is not based on that because my lack of check, of course, is fundamental in this. So, no. I have to emphasize that I am not a political scientist. I am basically a linguist interested in many things, as you've heard before, and I'm not a political scientist, that's one thing. So many of the things I'm telling today, many of you can do much better, and you will probably ask questions and be critical of what I'm going to say. My perspective basically is of a discourse analyst interested in, as a critical discourse analyst, interested also in socio-political stuff since many, many, many years. I just gave a summary for most of you about the development of discourse analysis since the 60s, 70s, and then also critical discourse study. And many people working in critical discourse study do political discourse studies, like Norman Fairclough in England, many other people like Ruth Wodak in Vienna and Lancaster. People have been interested since many. Ruth Wodak also founded a journal called the Journal of Language and Discourse, Language and Politics. So we have many people working in discourse analysis actually doing political analysis, but they are linguists doing something else as well. What I did not say before when I gave a list of all these disciplines involved in discourse studies, I did not mention political science. You remember? I said sociology, psychology, communication, anthropology. Political science wasn't there. Now that is very funny because if anything is discourse, it is politics. And of course you have also discourse with other means like, doing wars and so on and so on. But the funny thing is that although in all the social sciences discourse analysis is very popular, political science is some kind of an exception. Practically all people who do political discourse analysis are linguists and not people in political science. They're more interested in other kinds of things. They do read other different kind of things. They do different kind of analysis. Tradition is closer to philosophy. When you think about whatever, legitimation or other kinds, forms of power and power abuse and so on. Yes, because you have it in common with sociology. So interesting thing is that although discourse is so fundamental in politics, from debates in parliament to laws to political discourse of politicians and so on. So of course we already know since the dramas of Molière in the 16th, 17th century that yes, politics is done by words and discourse. So they should be combined. But most of the introductions to political discourse analysis are not, unfortunately, done by political scientists, and therefore also are limited. Many things which are relevant for people in political science, they are not being done by people in discourse analysis, even when they read a lot of. So also what I do today is done as a discourse analyst interested in politics and such. That's one thing, is what they call in discourse analysis a disclaimer. And a disclaimer is something like, things like, I'm not a racist, but. That's a disclaimer, all right? Now, and there are studies about it, and I wrote a lot about disclaimers in racist discourse. That's one thing. Another thing, when I started to do work on racism since the 1980s, that's already 40 years ago, and doing all kinds of analysis, I was more interested in how the mainstream was racist than how the extreme right was. We had in Parliament in Holland just one person on the extreme right. He was a nobody, had no power at all. He was more ridiculous than whatever. So I was now really interested. Now today, when we see with most of the elections also here next door in Slovakia and so on, if I see also in Portugal and so on, how the extreme right is winning more and more, even progressive countries like Holland and Sweden getting at least collaborating with the extreme right, we are worried, and I'm worried, and everyone is worried, so I'm interested. So what I did last year when they invited me to do a paper, some kind of conference, I said, okay, I'm not now interested in doing an analysis of the standard textbooks, standard politics, standard, mainstream. What about this extreme right? What can I say about it? So I was interested in the discourses and the ideologies of the extreme right. And since I have been working on ideology for a long time, I have a big book on ideology at the end of the 90s, and also many papers. And I've met many people, I've learned from them, like Michael Frieden in England, and of course many other people working on ideology also in social and political sciences. But I was specifically interested also in the extreme right. And I was reading about the extreme right, and I was reading also colleagues of ours in the United States, like Cas Mudder, who has been writing about populism, as you know, many things. And I was interested now, what exactly does this mean? All right, that is my background. So I used to be interested in political discourse, but in mainstream racism, not an extreme right wing. So when I started to read last summer many papers and books about the extreme right and their ideas and ideologies, and then also, as always, you read some and you become critical. You say, yes, is it like this? All right, so my talk today is about this particular kind of thing. Where does it come from? How does it show up in discourse? And what is my perspective on this kind of thing, especially as a discourse analyst and someone interested in ideology. And of course, you cannot really speak about the extreme right without also speaking about ideology. Wait a minute, if I have the right thing here. No, sorry. This is the old one. What is it? Yes. No, that one and that. Yes. Okay. In my last talk this morning, I said there was some kind of cultural revolution in the 60s, 70s, which also shows up in different disciplines blooming up. Suddenly we have semiotics, pragmatics, sociolinguistics, discourse analysis, and so on. Each discipline somehow was renewed. It was in a socio-political context which also has to do with all kinds of renewal. Just think about it, what happens. Of course, the feminist movement, but let's say even more important then was the civil rights movement. How can you possibly think of the history of the Western world without thinking about the civil rights movement in the United States, which has a massive influence until today? Black Lives Matter, which I mentioned this morning, is one of them, but there are many other things. The feminist movement, can you even think about it without that? But not only, we also had the gay movement, and of course the environmental movement, and so many things somehow were changing in the 60s, 70s, and for some strange reason, all in parallel. And in the same way as this morning was talking about the discursive turn, I think you can call also this, unlike if people say a cultural turn, a cultural revolution, and it has been called like that by many people. All right, now if I think about the extreme right, there are many ways to explain it, and people have been explaining this many ways, and I think that one of the ways you can understand, explain the extreme right, and you see that all these movements since the 1960s, 70s have to do with liberal changes in, it's called a cultural revolution in sexuality, gender, color, race, immigration, many other things. Everything somehow is changing norms and values, and it gets more and more liberal. Later I'm talking about these different kind of things. So there is a big cultural change since the 60s and the 70s. And it was sort of not dominant, but very influential in the 70s in the hippie movement. I happened to study in Berkeley in 73, and I know what it was all about. So it was there, and people were smoking pot, you know, this kind of thing. It was all these kind of different things at the same time. Women got more power, hippies got more power, there were alternative ways of seeing things. Now, you all know about these culture changes, and it has an influence all over the world, not just in Berkeley, but also in Western Europe, many countries, also Latin America. It has been there in many countries, so this cultural revolution. Now, these are changes on race, on sexuality, on gender, on the family. What kind of families are, you know, you have gay matrimony today, religion, more and more secularization. I still remember that in my dissertation of 72, in Holland, you had to add theses, also things which had nothing to do with the thesis. And I remember still, that's 50 years ago, that one of the theses was the renewal in the church and the army is only a form of publicity for the ideological notions of, what was it? Of the fatherland and God, you know. So already then, as a PhD student, I was aware of the things changing when I was writing my dissertation between 68 and 72, something like that. All more or less in parallel. So that was nothing. So it is also in education, we have more and more multiculturalism. We have about life and death with euthanasia. Now, you know, accepted also in Spain, you know. We have, of course, the environment with the ecological revolution. We have culture things like drugs, marijuana, clothes, hippies, and so on. Of course, also at the same time, decolonization, international, and so on. And of course, the media later with the social media and so on. And so somehow, people before who didn't have power somehow got more rights, more things to say, they become more prominent. Now, I think, and not only me, but many other people too, I think that much of the changes occurring today of the last 20 years in the social and political movement has to do with a reaction against all these liberal changes in all these fields, in the family, sexuality, gender, and so on and so on. And of course, also people have done this before, of course. We have the work on the cultural backlash. One of the ways to define the extreme right is to see it as a cultural backlash against all these kind of liberal changes. Actually, that's why Orban in Hungary is talking about an illiberal. It is exactly that. It is what is changing sociopolitically is because of all these changes, specific kind of people were losing power, respect, and so on and so on. White males, and so on and so on. And for example, in this book about the cultural backlash, for example, of Engelhardt and Norris, of the book of 2018, Cultural Backlash, Trump, Brexit, and the Rise of Authority and Populism. That's exactly what happened. It is a cultural backlash against everything what is changing in the last 20, 30 years. These liberal movements were more and more influential until about the 70s, 80s, and with Thatcher in England, Reagan in the United States, and many other people, somehow also socioeconomically things were changing. And with the social economic things were changing, also the cultural things were changing in the sense that people of conservative parties, for example, in Spain and then other countries as well, there was the way we as conservative party are defending our norms and values, you know, of the traditional family, religion, sexuality, and all these things, are not somehow in our political party defending very much, very well. So what happened in Holland, in Sweden, in Spain, in Latin America, in Chile, for example, what happened is that within the political parties, conservative political parties, there were groups of people who didn't think that the traditional conservative party on the right was strong enough to resist all these changes. And one of the ways these right-wing, extreme right-wing are changing also in Germany, with AfD and so on, is precisely this kind of radicalization of the conservative parties, especially also in the field of cultural changes. All right? That is why the book on the cultural backlash shows who is losing power and influence because of all these changes. All right, now. So that is one of the interesting analyses is, of course, the extreme right in many countries is not just culture. It's not just a question of sexuality, gender, and so on and so on. It also has to do with poverty and misery and so on. So there are also very important socioeconomic reasons why people don't feel represented by the, let's say, the leftist party, which actually lost power everywhere. For example, the Socialist Party in Holland is barely existing today, even in countries which are very powerful like Sweden. They have practically no power anymore. So where political parties of the left had quite a lot of power in many countries, they have lost that power in the last 20 years. So that is very interesting, that people who felt expelled, not included, and so on, because they have ways of explaining it in, for example, all these immigrants coming in, all these women have now power, all these, and so on. So they were able, like 100 years ago, people always accused the Jews of doing this kind of thing. They now also have other people to explain this kind of thing. So there is a mixture of socio-economic, cultural, political reasons for this existence and a growing of the extreme right. All right, so that is a little bit different from the book of the cultural backlash. I would say, yes, there is this kind of thing, how different kind of groups of people felt excluded and no longer, and therefore started to vote, at least for some time, for the extreme right. So that is one explanation. Now, what I am interested in is not just the political background analysis of this kind of thing, also, if I'm talking about illiberal changes, again, illiberal changes, how do they come first? Again, here, first. They have to do with ideology, ideas people have about this. It's not a real thing of where the power goes and doesn't go. It is how they think about it. Therefore, also political analysis always needs to be, like discourse analysis, always not only have to see what people actually say in discourse analysis, but also what they think, or they imply when they say. So that's why it's so important. So what I'm talking about now is a fundamental change of the cultural contexts, combined with a change in the socio-economic context, poverty, immigration, different kinds of industries coming up, now even with artificial intelligence. Somehow people feel more and more excluded in this particular kind of thing. And it comes together with the increasing power, for example, of China. So it's not just a local stuff, it is a very international kind of thing that we somehow losing out, and because of this kind of thing, people lose their job. And if tomorrow they lose a job also because of chat, GPT, and artificial intelligence, it gets worse. You know, so all these things together in a complex way, are the causes, the complex causes of the growth of the extreme right. Now, since I'm interested to explain this thing in more detail, and we'll have a look at the discourses afterwards, I'm interested also in the ideological stuff. What about these ideologies? There's no time today. It will be another lecture to give you a lecture about the theory of ideology as I see it. But you know about ideology since Marx, more than 150 years ago, and Marx and Engels, for it was, something like false consciousness. So again, ideology was there, very good, it's conscious, and false like fake, sort of. And then we later learned, so people have been using for more than 100 years this notion of false consciousness without actually doing what should be done, namely the analysis of these ideologies which are in the heads of people. Karl Mannheim a little bit more, so he distinguished between ideologies and utopias, and so we know, but that's in the 30s, all right, that's a long time ago. And then people in political science, like Michael Freed in England and many other people have been studying ideology as belief systems. Again, it's something here. So an ideology is some kind of belief system. But unfortunately, because they're political scientists, they never opened the book in Cognition, which is a pity, because that, of course, you also have to do. As I just said before and this morning too, if you want to do something which has to do with other disciplines, open a book in one. So the question then is, if we talk about ideology in the heads of people, what is the structure? So I have, when I prepared my book 20 years ago about ideology, I have a whole bookcase full of books on ideology, many. None of these books ever talked about the structure of the mind and ideology, no one, never. They did not study, for example, the way ideologies come up in discourse either. So they also did not open a book on discourse now, which is also a pity, because if you do a detailed analysis of discourse, you can somehow reconstruct what are the ideologies in the mind of people. Now, what I'm interested in today is if these illiberal changes being all over the place, also here, also especially in Slovakia and Western Europe, whatever. I mean, said what kind of ideologies are involved there? Is there just one ideology? Is it something like an extremist, we call them extremist parties, radical parties, and people usually also make a distinction between and the other. So what is the ideology of these right-wing parties? Now let me first correct something. First of all, an ideology is a form of social cognition. It is never one person having an idea. It's always a collective kind of thing. It's social cognition. You share it with other members of what you call an ideological group. Feminist, anti-feminist, racist, anti-racist, and so on and so on. Any kind of ideological group developed, historically speaking, an ideology. For example, a racist ideology in order to justify slavery or to discriminate against, and so on and so on. The same way you have anti-feminist ideology, for example, the extreme right now in Spain, and so on and so. You have people somehow have kind of an ideology. So an ideology is a form of social cognition, socially based on some kind of ideological group, like racist, anti-racist, feminist, and so on and so on. And the ideology is very abstract. It's just a very fundamental principles of things. It has to do, which I mentioned already this morning about talking about manifestos. One of the categories of ideology is identity. Who are we? We whites, we men, and so on. And two, what typically do we do? What are our aims? What are norms and values? And against whom is our ideology? Like feminists against macho men, and so on and so on. So these are the basic categories, but this is very abstract. The basic ideological debate is never at this very abstract level. It's just very fundamental. It's always at a level which is more specific. It's at the level of what in social psychology is called attitudes. The attitudes about immigration, about the capital punishment, about gay marriage, about euthanasia, and so on. All these things were changing the debate since the 60s and 70s was not only about fundamental things like ideology. Yes, we had norms and values like equality and justice and so on, but the debate was about specific attitudes about social issues. And the social issues were these. For example, in all right-wing parties in Europe, number one, immigration. All of them. All right, so this debate is not about fundamental ideology, but a specific kind of thing. And about the debate about these issues is shown up also in the individual ideas people have. And I interviewed people in California and also in Amsterdam. What do you think about your neighbor nowadays? And people start to tell stories about all these Turks, and so on. And in California about all these Mexicans coming in. So these were individual opinions of people. That's not the same as an ideology. It's an individual opinion based on personal experiences. And for that, we also have in psychology a special word, a special notion called mental models. People have mental models of concrete experiences. It's me and my neighbors. And the stories are based on these mental models about what happens. So people tell stories in these interviews about their experiences with a Turkish neighbor who don't clean the way and so on, or even slaughter sheep in their bathrooms, this kind of story, all right? So you have a fundamental ideology specified for more specific attitudes like immigration, and then personal stories of people who tell these kind of things, and they show them up in their discourses. The way they talk about these immigrants is shown up in the discourse that they have. Negative representation of people. So you see how ideology is being reproduced by everyday stories and the things they read in newspapers. So any story on the social media or in traditional media about immigrants who take away our jobs and so on, they are somehow each time a confirmation of the ideology. They're slowly learning. Ideologies are very complex. You never learn an ideology from one day to the next. No one becomes a feminist in one day. And once you are a feminist, you don't change to an opposite anti-feminist in one day. It's a slow process through these everyday experiences, reading a newspaper and other kinds of social media. So it's a complex thing. That's about ideology. Now the question now is, and that's my question last year when I studied this, is there something like an extreme right-wing ideology, yes or no? So against many of the people who in the newspaper or in studies say, the right-wing ideology is such and such, I'm saying, no, there is no such thing. Why? Because it's much more complicated. A right-wing ideology is not one thing, actually it's a cluster of ideologies. It's several ideologies, so extreme right is a combination of a sexist, racist, and so on. So they combine ideologies about the environment, about sexuality, about families, and so on and so on. So this actually, a right-wing ideology is more a cluster of ideologies than one ideology. So if you want to define by ideology a political party of the extreme right, you cannot simply say, oh, the ideology of Vox, or SPD here, or AfD in Germany is so and so. That's wrong. You have to be more detailed. You have to say it's a combination of ideology, some of which are more dominant, depends not only on the history of each country, but also the socio-political context. So in certain countries, some clusters or combinations of ideologies are more relevant and useful to get votes than in other countries. All right? Now, if we do a systematic analysis of these ideas and this whole cultural changes, and you compare different kind of countries. For example, as I did for this paper, I just got the message this morning that it was, I just heard this morning it will be published. It's between a paper and a book. It's about this topic, ideology and discourse of the extreme right. It will be published by Cambridge. They have some kind of small things and so on. It has just been accepted, so I can now say yes, it will be published. And what I did was, I did an analysis of the electoral progress in Chile which I know quite well because my ex-wife is from Chile, so I know the situation there very well. I went there and so on. I wanted to know how a very traditional Catholic country also has a right-wing party, what they are interested in, especially relevant, of course, in Chile, is, of course, anything which has to do with Catholicism. So typically, as you will see also in the examples in a minute, one of the first things they are interested in is an abortion, which is, of course, totally impossible. And of course, euthanasia, the same thing. Anything which has to do with gender, same thing. So in Chile, and then Spain is also Catholic, but not anymore so much. It's changing very quickly. And for example, Catholicism in Spain is important. So yes, officially the extreme right in Spain is sort of against, you know, these kind of things like abortion, but it's not as prominent. It's not like in Chile, number one. Now give to Holland and Sweden. You think you can get votes in Sweden by being against abortion? Not a single vote. Because the consensus is that abortion is okay. Or the right of women to have an abortion is okay. Same in Holland. So Wilders, the guy who won the elections in Holland, he can get many people maybe against immigration, yes. But not against feminism, like in Spain, or like, for example, questions like abortion, gay marriage, and this kind of thing. So the curtain thing is, as you can see, and as you know, but now we know that it's not just one ideology, it is in principle a cluster of ideology, and the cluster and its topics, like abortion, immigration, and so, will adapt to what in each country is the consensus or not. So in a country where practically everyone in the majority has no problem with abortion, that will not be a major topic in the discourses and the way of thinking of these things. So you have to find in each country. So in Sweden, again, abortion, gay marriage, euthanasia, no problem. But immigration is an issue, and especially young gangs of immigrants who, you know, fight each other and kill and so on and so on. And there's a serious problem of law and order, which is a topical right-wing topic. So what you can find is that specifically in Sweden, if you want to get votes at the extreme right, you have to focus on what in that country is dominant and so on. So if the newspapers and the social media, everyone is explaining against all this action of immigrant gangs, killing each other and so on, and the weapons being used, emphasized in all public discourses, then you see how when there is a basis of a typical European racist ideology, which exists already for hundreds of years, against people from the East, people from the South, and so on and so on, that particular racist ideology is there. And it will focus on specific issues. And the issue is maybe not they take away our jobs, but they take away our security. So in order to gain elections in Sweden, you have to emphasize in your discourses constantly about that particular kind of thing. So you see how it's not just one thing. First of all, that you have to know what the ideology is. Second, that it combines in different things. You have the combination of nationalist and racist as nativist ideology, which is very, very typical in Europe. But that, for example, is not very relevant in Chile, where you do have immigrants from Venezuela and so on and so on. But it's not the main topic. You don't get many votes. So you see how the development of the issues, the attitudes were in the heads of people, and the discourses which show these attitudes somehow adapt to the situation in each country. So that is what this paper, big paper of me, is all about. And I would like to have a look at some of the examples if we can see certain kind of things. So in the, let me say first one thing. Those of you who have studied the extreme right and who have studied populism know the work of my colleague, Dutch colleague in the United States, called Cas Mudde, M-U-D-D-E. He's very famous, has written many studies on the extreme right. And what he says is that populism is what he called a thin ideology. Now, what would that exactly mean? You can see, as I said this morning, I repeat that again, why didn't he open a book on ideology? Because a thin ideology doesn't make sense. You have feminism and anti-feminism and socialism and so on. So these ideologies has, but thin ideology doesn't make any sense. And even more complicated is you have, as you know, leftist and right-wing populism. Now this is even more complicated. How can it be an ideology on the one hand associated with socialism and on the other hand with, right-wing conservative, and so it doesn't make sense. So several authors have said there's no such thing as a right-wing ideology or called populist. In the press, yes. The newspapers typically say populist so-and-so. What they mean is usually a right-wing person here in Europe. Like Orban, and so on, Wilders in Holland, and so on, like people in Spain. So, yes, there is what is relevant of populism is not so much the ideology, but again, depends on the country. It may be racist, nationalist, anti-feminist, like in Spain, and so on. It is a cluster of ideologies which, depending on each country, is manifest in specific kinds of issues. And what makes a politician more populist than others is not so much the ideologies, that the way they talk. It is more a property of discourse. Okay, and then Casmerde and many other people say it is something which has the polarization between the poor and pure people against the castas, against the elites. And so this polarization between, is that the notion of, that's why maybe he called it an ideology, because as I'm now explaining, structures of ideology have to do with in-groups and out-groups, us and them. So that's, but it has to do more with the structure of discourse of people who want to get votes on the left or on the right, it doesn't matter. So you can have this kind of polarization. You could also say for something like, who is a socialist? Also would claim of poor people against the elites who just make money, rich people, and so on. The discourse structure is the same, and therefore you can call it populist. But it does not, the ideology is very different between a socialist one and an extreme right wing. Okay, so the ideology is very different. The way you talk is very similar. And one of the classical things is the polarization between the poor people, whom we at extreme right defend, against the people who are in power, which is typically the party which is not in power in the country. Like in Spain, very clearly in Spain, against the Socialist Party in Spain. So the extreme right in Spain is mostly against independentista parties in Catalonia, but mostly also in the text against the socialist prime minister. All right, so the elites is not any kind of elite, because when they are in power, of course, no longer relevant. It is against the party about which we do not defend. All right, so you get all these kind of things of polarization and so on. So if populism is a discourse phenomenon, you can have the semantics of discourse is the polarization between the poor, the pure, wonderful people and the bad, corrupt elites. That's a semantic issue. But populist discourse is usually not only, it's a question of style, the kind of non-parliamentary language being used, insulting people. So if you think of populists in various countries and you see how they talk, for example, Wilders also in Holland, and also the kind of discourse they use, their lexical item, their metaphors, their many aspects of style and rhetoric has to do with a populist style of speaking. Again, it's not an ideology, it's a way of talking which traditionally politicians did not use. And if you say that people suddenly insult people in parliament, like now, for example, now today in Spain, or for example, also in England, or other day in Germany, and so on and so on. If you do this analysis, it's a combination of semantic, stylistic, rhetorical structures which are typically identified, but it's not a question of ideology, let alone a thin ideology, which has no sense. Okay, so now with this particular kind of theory, I would like to have a look, if you have time, to the examples. There is no time to do it all, because we know as discourse analysts, if you want to do a discourse analysis, it takes hours. That's the problem of discourse analysis. You cannot just do it in a second. Now, what I did, for example, first I compared of all this theory about populism and about ideologies and what ideologies are and are not. I said, now let me apply this, analyzing the electoral programs in Chile, in Spain, in Holland, and in Sweden, which all had just recently new elections. So I said, this is not the way these politicians speak in everyday language and meetings. This is the official program, which of course is a different kind of discourse genre. They may be much more aggressive, much more informal in everyday talk, but I want to be sure to be able to compare it. I said, I'm going to use the same kind of discourse genre, and one of the aspects of genre is not only their structure and meaning and so on, but especially their context. When one of the definitions of a discourse genre is the context where it's being used. So an electoral program is the same kind of genre because it's typically a text being used in elections and for this particular kind of people, and so it's a different kind of thing that when they talk among each other and their party headquarters. It's a different kind of genre. Okay, so, and I was interested not just in any kind of discourse analysis, but in kind of ideological analysis, and then see how it shows up in text, in talk, okay? So for each country, I had this little schema you find on this page for Chile, for example. So the political party there is Partido Republicano, and the guy doing this is called Antonio Cast, and this is of 2019. So I put on the left the kind of ideology cluster you can find in Chile. And typically, first of all, and dominant is Catholicism. The order is important here. Then nationalism, and then liberalism and neoliberalism. So it's a mixture, a strange mixture of different ideologies. And as I said, the debate is not at the level of ideology, but the debate is about issues. Issues are the socio-political structure which correspond to what social scientists call attitudes in the heads of people. You have an attitude about immigration, and the issue is immigration, okay? So the major attitudes in Chile, for example, are negative about abortion, euthanasia, positive about the family, you know, a family should consist of a man and a woman and so on and so on, about the homeland, and then typically patriotism. Again, patriotism is not an ideology. Patriotism is a way of nationalism functioning about, you know, about homeland. So one of the other errors typically in political science also of Kaz Murder, for example, is call every ism an ideology. Wrong. There's no such thing as an ideology of authority, or I can never say the word, authoritarianism. The same thing with patriotism. Patriotism is not an ideology. It's a way of doing nationalism. So not each ism is an ideology. You have to distinguish between an attitude and an ideology, all right? So for example, racism is an ideology, and immigration, things, you have to know. Okay, so here we have centralization, and then some freedom of the people and social justice. So would you expect at the extreme right an emphasis on social justice? Well, this particular guy, yes, because it's a very poor country with many poor people. So you get, as also happens with Marine Le Pen in France and Wilders in Holland, they know that the people they want to have votes for are also miserable people who don't salaries and so on. So somehow there's always, sometimes the extreme right ideologies look like a sort of socialism for poor people and so on, of course not really distributing power and income and so on, but it also appears in the text. And of course, always social market economy. Now look at, for example, a couple of examples in Chile. I put, in the beginning, I put the ideology, and then after the ideology, also some issues as they come up in attitudes. So for example, in the first example, number 1, the ideology is Catholicism. I have doubts about whether religions are ideologies. I put here Catholicism because ideologies dominate many, many things of everyday life. So for now, yes, Catholicism is an ideology, but there might be a doubt about that. And then the specific attitudes are negative about abortion and euthanasia. And now, how this ideology and the specific attitudes in the head of these people, how does it show it up in text and talk is what I do as a discourse analyst. And there's a direct consequence of the transcendent and dignified nature of all people. You know what that is? Do you know? But just ask you, you read this. You start with this. This is the official electoral program in Chile. And they begin, and as a direct consequence of the transcendent and dignified nature of all people. What is the transcendent nature of people? I guess most of you, like me at least, would say, I don't know exactly what that means. That's exactly the point. One typical thing of many right-wing discourses is they use notions which don't have very precise meaning, but have some kind of association. Like, this is a typical talk which you expect of a priest and not of a political, this kind of thing. So many times you have this kind of vaguely associating and so on. Is what we defend, nature of all people, is that we defend their life, which is fine, from conception to natural death. Now, what does it mean? It doesn't say explicitly here against abortion and against euthanasia. It will be afterwards, yes. But what happens is they use vague, general words which look at first sight, we defend, of course you defend life. But when does life start and when does it end, and so on and so on. So it may be vague, philosophical-like language, which people don't actually know what they mean, and so on, to sort of pretend, also defend themselves against, accusations of, so see, and then it says, the life from conception to natural death. So that implies, it doesn't say explicitly here, against abortion, against euthanasia, because euthanasia of human is not natural death. Without exceptions. Now, one of the things of typical discourse analysis is you take each word seriously. That's very important. I mean, discourse analysis is not just, oh, it's there, but you say, why would that be there? You always had, so a very good question of doing discourse analysis, why is that particular thing without exception there? My view of this, and interpretation is, if you don't admit any exceptions, it is typical of a radical position, all right? People who are radical say, there is no exception to this, whatever happens. A woman cannot abort, whatever, never. Now that, even Trump yesterday said, no, So, the structures of discourse which define the nature of the political party. It is a radical right-wing, it's not just conservative party. Many conservatives in Chile are against abortion and so on, but the way he formulates it is more radical, and that's exactly what I'm saying. The the extreme right, and the radical right, or the reactionary right, as I call it also, is a radicalization of the Conservative Party, and it shows up in text. Okay? So, being absolutely opposed, why absolutely, again? He can simply say, we are opposed to, but he doesn't say opposed to, we are absolutely so, without exception, absolutely, and so on. These are words out there have a function. The function is to emphasize their political position to the right of the Conservative Party. That's the discursive expression of, okay, opposed to abortion and all its forms. Again, it's not just against abortion, but abortion in all its forms. Again, it's the radical position. So you can think, okay, some kind of abortion is allowed. No. So you see how the text itself indexes, as you say in sociolinguistics, it indexes something about the position people have at the extreme right. All right? In other terms, euthanasia or any action that directly seeks the artificial interruption of human life. Any action. So I would call that a form of relevance analysis. You look not just at any kind of grammatical structure, you look what aspects of the text somehow are related to the political position of the party. And in this case, it's not just a conservative party, but it's a right-wing, radical, or in my view also, a reactionary right-wing party, and it shows up in text. Now, the same thing in example 2, for example, again, the same ideology, but not applied now to euthanasia, but then a positive thing. Most of these right-wing parties are against anything liberal, but they also have this idea of something positive, and especially to emphasize the family. And he says here, for this reason, we believe that, again, look at all the cognitive notions in these texts. For example, the beginning of Black Lives Matter, the pacifist, the manifesto of Black Lives Matter in the United States, in its website is what we believe. Again, it is in the text. We are not talking any kind of discourse, but it has to do again with here. It is something which has to do with the structure of ideologies. Okay? For this reason, we believe that based on this family ideal, children have the right to have a father and a mother, so society must make every effort to create the conditions for the exercise of this right. Okay, it's very simple. You know, family is basic and it should be, and no 2 fathers, 2 mothers, you know, and so on and so on. All right? But then again, of course, most of the right-wing parties may be in favor of trying to get votes of right-wing of poor people, but they cannot hide that they also are, you know, conservative parties, which of course, now look at the example of the ideology is neoliberalism in example 3, and of course, one value very important, a very attitude important neoliberal is the freedom of enterprise. If there is one attitude in neoliberalism is that enterprise must be free. All right, so here, Republicans believe in a social market economy. From foregoing follows again, you see, again, it follows that several times we see structures of argumentation. So one of the interesting studies of this electoral program is do an argumentation analysis because the text it indexes constantly, it follows, it implies, and so on. From the following follows our resolute and fierce defense. You see, resolute and fierce, again, not anything. The free private initiative in economic matters. Our defense of constitutional guarantees in order to prevent the state from invading the field and so on. That is a definition of neoliberalism applied to the attitudes of free enterprise. So now that is something typically in Chile. Now look at just, we still have time, right? Look at a few, we don't do everything because no time. Look at Spain. Now Spain is also Catholic, and also we have Opus Dei, and you know, typically right-wing Catholic, and part of Vox in Spain has this background of conservatism. Now look, let's look what the ideologies are and what the social issues as represented in attitudes and how it shows up in text. Again here, nationalism. Spain is a reality that transcends the Spaniards and a certain time and place. Now again, I can ask you, or let's say it's first year student, what does that mean exactly? I don't know, but that's typically what I'm saying is they have this way of formulating specific, very abstract kind of thing. So what is that Spain, the nation, as something that transcends the Spaniards of a certain time, and this way of using vague philosophical kind of principles and so on, it happens all the time. It's not only very concrete things against abortion, but there is some kind of philosophical vagueness behind. It happens all the time, here too. In certain times, it is the inheritance received from our ancestors that we must take care of and improve to bequeath it to our next generation. Our homeland is the guarantee of rights and equality, especially of the most vulnerable. So now you see here a combination of different kind of ideologies. On the one is nationalism. It has to do with tradition. It has to do with people, our children, and so on. We believe that nation is not just you and me, but is something transcendental, you know, this kind of thing. But it also has to do with things like the homeland. So it has to do with patriotism, you know, that you have to defend. It's not just you have to identify, but it's also something you have to defend. You have to be actively. So anything which is against our country, like immigration, or Europe and the European Union and so on, anything which is against this kind of thing, we have to be against. So nationalism is applied to this particular kind of thing, and the text itself, you can see what kind of dimension it has, you know? Like also the notion of, see, for example, to improve and to bequeath to the next generation, the style itself, it also had this kind of formality, okay? So let's see, for example, also another aspect of nationalism, the following example 5. We will provide maximum legal protection to the symbols of the nation. So again, defending the nation is what you call patriotism. And you do it in many ways. And now this example gives you an idea how the extreme right wants it to do. So with protection of the symbols of the nation, especially the flag, the anthem, and the crown. Now that's interesting. For nationalists, crucial is not actually the people who live there and their income and their happiness and so on, but the symbols of the nation. So, for example, the anthem, national anthem, and the flag and the crown, the symbols of the nation are very important. And whatever you do, you cannot burn the flag, you cannot insult the law, the king, and so on and so on. Now that's interesting. What happens now, as in Holland, we have the same thing. We also have a king. And what happened is that the king suddenly was excusing in Holland, for example, excusing Holland for being a country participating in slavery. Now that is what nationalists typically deny and don't want to talk about anything negative about the history of the country. So colonialism, slavery, you can discuss, actually you cannot discuss it at all. So when the king does so, you get something like a contradiction. On the one hand, you have to be in favor of the king, but if the king suddenly says something which is more typical liberal, you have a complication. So the extreme right wing in Holland suddenly is no longer as royalist as they are in Spain. So sometimes you have this kind of contradictions. So the flag and the crown, the penalties for offenses and outrages against Spain and the symbols or emblems must be aggravated so that a fraud and so on and so on. Again, that's one of the dimensions of the extreme right is law and order. So if you don't do that, it's just impolite. It is like a crime. You should be punished. And therefore it says aggravated punishment. Again, you have this hyperbolic way of talking about the situation, and it shows up in these cases. That means it is a right-wing, radical right-wing. It's not done to insult the king, no, it should be punished, and even harshly punished. Okay, so that's typical of the extreme. Let me just to finish. There are many others. Let me just have an idea about Holland, my own country, which I am afraid to say. I don't live in Holland for more than 25 years, but I'm still Dutch. I have Dutch passport, and I still feel more shame than maybe other people. Just have one example to finish, example 10. To give you an example, this guy Wilders is just one guy who does all these kind of things. And he's now probably going to form a government with other parties, which already is terrible. And he is very especially against Islam. So his issue is, Islam. And so he promised to prohibit not only immigration, but also to destroy mosques and so on and so on. Of course, to be prime minister, you cannot be that radical, so he may be sort of more tolerant about this kind of thing. But if you read this text, it's so explicitly racist that one can wonder, how is it possible that politicians in Holland can form a government with people who are thus explicitly racist? It also thinks you about political structure and so, and I just read yesterday in a newspaper in Holland, that people who are not that radical say, is what we have. We cannot do anything because we cannot form a government, if not that party also should, and so on. Whatever, and so is he not against the constitution? So it's complicated. But just give you an idea how nationalism is expressed in progressive Holland. All right, give you an idea. Okay, the Islam doesn't belong to the Netherlands, and that there is nothing more unwise than to give free rein to the Islamic ideology that wants to take away our freedom. Political games, corrupt lawsuits, and Islamic fatwas will not stop me. Islam is not primarily a religion, but the most violent political ideology in existence. The word Islam means submission, and that is exactly what it's aiming for. Islam plays a role that is unfreedom, misery, and violence. The freedom and dignity of non-Muslims dismissed as kafir is literally and metaphorically violent done. Jews, Christians, gays, apostates, and women are often the first victims of Islamization. Unfortunately, we also see this in the Netherlands. It is inexcusable that the political elite of Europe and the Netherlands have welcomed this terrible Islam with open arms. Now, that's an example of a text which manifests an attitude. It's not ideology, it's an attitude of Islamophobia. So the ideology will be racism. The specific kind of attitudes about against Islam, that's a specific, and this is the way it's being formulated. A negative representation of Islam with all these negative kind of things, lies and implications and so on. So the idea of the ideology is emphasize the negative things of them and emphasize the positive things of us. For example, the freedom of our women. Suddenly he becomes a feminist here. Why? Because he knows that one of the ways he can argue in Holland against Islam is that in Islam women have less freedom than in our positive country. So you see how in one text it combines the ideological square, which I mentioned, emphasize our good things, emphasize their bad things, and deny our bad things, like our colonialism, and so on and so on. There's much more to say, but I want to step here and ask your questions. There's more. Look at these examples if you like, if there's more time, and see how ideologies, attitudes, and how they show up in different kind of discourse. These are just short examples, also out of context, but it gives you an idea how the discourses of the extreme right, the ideology structure adapts to each country, and also the way you talk about it adapts to each country. So in Holland, you have to say that Islam is against women. Why? Because if not, and so on. So it adapts. In a country more Catholic, everything is around the family and abortion and that kind of thing. But I'm sure you now have questions.
Yeah, well, many thanks for the lecture. Obviously, for someone who is kind of coming from the political science and somehow sometimes uses this critical discourse analysis lenses to understand politics, that was extremely interesting. And I was wondering, in your analysis of radical right, you were talking about a lot of differences, like the basically context-specific things and so on. But would you say that there are some, let's say, values or let's say ideological kind of sticking points that are kind of in common among these different contexts, or there is actually nothing in
There are
common?
different ideologies. What is the word? I didn't hear the word. Do you say that ideologies which? Tell me, what did you ask?
Well, I was basically asking that you were talking about differences a lot and kind of saying the different things are emphasized in different contexts.
Yes.
But is there something that you would say, okay, that actually appears in all contexts, among all parties and all actors?
Yes, I think at least in Europe, all ideologies are also European racist. All of them. Something. In a vague way, in a radical way, and so on. All ideologies, all texts I've seen in many countries is also, for example, look briefly, preparing for today, also what the SPD, for example, say also against immigration, not only Orban, against defending Christianity against Muslim and so on, but most right-wing ideology is also racist and very often also nationalist. And this combination, which many people, also Mudde and others, call nativist, you know, racist and nationalist as a combination, is that I'm not saying it's everywhere. And for example, racism in Chile does not appear very obviously in the, for example, in the electoral program of the extreme right, but I know for a fact that in the newspapers and everyday language, it is very dominant and therefore also influence the votes. For example, since not two ways, everything needs more analysis. As you know, in Chile, we have most people who originally come from Europe, you know, many countries. But in the south, your original indigenous people, Mapuche, live mostly in the south, and so on and so on. So one of the first ways the extreme right is shown is that there is no way that the rights of indigenous people is somehow represented. Actually, the last elections, there was a new constitution, for example, which defends, for example, indigenous people, and the constitution then was voted down because it gave too much rights to indigenous peoples. That's one thing. And that is with typically young people who are from this indigenous, like in many countries, from this indigenous group, are discriminated in school because of the language and many, many things, it's very complex. That's one aspect. It is not so explicit in the electoral program, but it is there in all kinds of other things, and it does also influence on how people vote. And the second thing is that since the situation in Venezuela, you know, with the Bolivarian revolution, there were hundreds of thousands of refugees coming all over Latin America, and they also went to Chile. And you get the same thing like Turks and Moroccans in Holland, in Germany, and so on. All these poor people, they want to have a job and so on. Again, it's not in this program, but in everyday right-wing discourse, it's very prominent and so on. And actually, I have PhDs who study how teachers in school deal with this particular kind of thing in school and so on. Oh yes, it is there. So I would say that not just racism as such, but maybe more specifically European racism or Eurocentrism is, of course, in practically all of Europe, but also of all the immigrants who went there in Latin America and in the United States, it is all Eurocentric, white people against minorities, immigrants, black people, Africans, and so on. That is very, very generally the case. And many other ones, nationalism too. Maybe it doesn't appear so obvious, but many of them are, for example, nationalist in the sense of the symbols and so on, but also you cannot say something negative about our country. So also most of them are revisionist. For example, in Holland, you cannot talk about Holland as a colonial party, or in Spain, you cannot talk. There are texts you will see here too, is for example Spain about all these, they brought civilization to all these people in the Americas. So emphasizing the good things about us, Europe, against, and so on. So I would say racism is very, very general. And then of course, obviously, any feminist, he would say, you forgot about male chauvinism. Is it universal? I think it is. So if anything, I think male chauvinism as an ideology is practically universal. Unless you come, and then maybe there are studies, of course, of certain societies where women are in power and so on, but generally speaking, in most countries and most everyday practices and so, women have less salary, less power, less rights, and so on, and so on, and so on. So, yes, if you ask which is the ideology, which is most generally the case in the world, it would be that. Of course, where you have men and women, you have that. And then racism and nationalism too, and Catholicism more specifically, whereas in the United States, of course, it's not national Catholicism, but other religions. And then you get more specific ideologies and so on. You know, for example, this concept of family structure, is that universal? It is probably not just Catholicism, it may be more general wherever your family is. Like a real family is mother, father, and children. But I started to do this work last summer. So forgive me that I don't have replied to all kind of things, but suddenly if you do an international comparative analysis of ideologies, you probably will find certain kinds of words dominate. If in countries things change, like in Holland and Sweden, certain kind of ideologies are suddenly less relevant. For example, family structure, the defense of homosexuality, and so on, and so on, and so on. I would say that you can no longer get votes in Holland and Sweden with that kind of thing. But with immigration, yes. All right, so that's, you have to see how these things go. Other questions? By the way, I did say this morning, if you're now listening, you have no question of when you're studying, working, and you think, well, I don't agree with this kind of thing, or maybe why does he not read, as I said, my email is also on the handout, I think. You can always write me, and I always reply to all my email messages, always. So if you have a question, you have doubts, or you want to press, or you say, I'm working on a PhD, and so on, so, what about this? Then send me a question. I always learn from these particular kind of things, because, as I say, this topic of the extreme right is something I just started a year ago, a little bit more. So I am not a specialist like many other people, but I'm interested in something which has to do also with here, the detailed structure of ideologies and the ways they somehow show up also in discourse. That's what I'm interested in as a discourse analyst. And going through discourse analysis, I think I also can contribute by doing an analysis of ideology. You know, for example, there is a whole, in political science, there's a group of people in various countries who do study, for example, electoral programs, only that. You know, so there's several people in different countries who do that particular kind of thing. They're specialists in this kind of thing, but they are not discourse analysts, and they are not cognitive analysts, and that's what's missing. Anyway, no questions? If not, thank you very much.